I want to just introduce our amazing readers for tonight. We're really excited to have them. Our first reader, Shiv Kotecha, is a poet and critic whose forthcoming book, The Switch, published by Wonder Press, is best described as an apology, a manual on obedience, and a poem by the unlovable Lord fucking Shiva. The swear word broke our Facebook ad, just so you know. They didn't like it. He's the author of Extrigue, Outfits, and Paint This Rock. He is currently a PhD candidate at NYU, finishing a dissertation titled Decomposition as Explanation, The Forms of Duration from Poe to Post-Conceptualism. Please give Shiv a big welcome. Thank you.
There's a stain on the floor. Yeah, no, that's good. I'd like to read by a stain. Blood stain. Happy National Poetry Day. Happy National Vodka Day. I'm going to read from a small thing from my manuscript, The Switch, which is coming out. There's a couple sections in it. One section is called Obedience Residency Manual. And sort of conceit behind it is it was like an instructional manual for myself to give myself tasks instead of texting my lover, I love you. And then I ended up writing a bunch of things that like sort of came from this. Is that good? So this is called Discarnate Nude. Say you encounter at some point a feeling, probably momentary, that leads you to believe that reaching out, saying I love you, is the most important thing to do. Perhaps you think this will make a brand new kind of pleasure possible for this whatever X person to have, or will at least reduce the vulnerability they feel, when in fact the ways that you've deemed appropriate to reach out in the first place, hi, or hey, how are you, or I just wanted to check in and see how you were, it's been a while, I'm really glad we can talk, or hey BB, I love you, fulfill no actual purpose other than to calm you down, providing for you, not them, momentary relief that is equitable in kind to the effects of taking 1/4 of a Xanax with food, or hitting a bowl 2 to 3 times, followed by a hot shower, or jerking off once, or twice. Or jerking off 100 times to the same scene over and over again until the video itself begins to shudder, its contents suddenly rendered unfamiliar and disfigured inside the screen you have propped up upon your chest like an iron curtain between your face where your eyes are and your legs where your dick is. Until all of the scenes, whatever details that have the last 99 times at least successfully made the bodies in it seem impressively specific to you, a little special even, maybe because of the lighting, or maybe you think because of the occasional flickering of various unexpected traces of the body that the lighting, despite the loose narrative, increases your chances of seeing. The irregular hair pattern, the flecks of eczema, spoiler alert, the dirty fingernails, the mildly inflamed warts, the small map of ass pimples, the particularly chapped lip, all start to discarnate, each whatever detail receding enough from focus so that for at least a moment other things can be seen. The rather generic postures the people in the scene were specifically instructed to take, for instance, or the two, maybe more, soft but muscular and ageless bodies that have on them a head-to-toe glisten, due, you think, decandid to a very effective placement of lights. Yes, you moan suddenly. A single high-key light, definitely. A fill and 1 or maybe 2 hot hair lights so as to focus the jerker-offer's attention on the asses, sacks, and faces of the men, while remaining mobile, so that over the duration of the film, the whatever jerker-offer is guided to draw his focus into the image, upon the actors, deflecting his attention away from the rather nondescript set the two agents, in this case, have chosen to fuck inside of. But not this time. This time you've stumbled beyond the facade and you say to yourself out loud, once again, yes. That's definitely a well-placed keynote light, set up by a crew of other unphotographed but likely very sweaty men in the upper left corner of the room the scene is shot in. You notice in the right-hand corner of the frame near the couch the pair of shorts that were removed by Jason in the final outdoor scene of picking up trash, and on the other side of the frame, the left on the floor, the pipe put in and never removed from AJ's ass in bareback rednecks. and in the center of the frame on the table, the pair of wine glasses that appear as the main transitional object in Panic Love, the switch, which launches the 40-minute or so fantasy sequence in which the young whatever sleeping lover successfully seduces his new stepfather moments after the young lover's mother leaves the room. In this film, a kitchen. But not before the stepfather pours out 2 and not 3 glasses of wine, telling his young stepson while he does it in an act of observed and appreciated bonding, a story about when he, the stepfather, was himself a boy and hitchhiked all by himself, catching trout and rides across the wilds of Montana. The wine glasses, of course, are never sipped during the duration of the fantasy, but they're returned to in a close-up shot later, to bookend the scene before slowly fading out to a shot of a young lover's smooth, unconscious face before the camera zooms out to reveal his body stretching across and over a twin-sized cot, to the left of which the reveal continues. The rugged stepfather is kneeling on the floor, reaching out to blow the young waking body. You pause, grunt, continue. In front of you is a room full of objects suggestively arranged in previously unused locations, a tool shed, in this case, which now you've jerked off to 1 to 99 times. Extraordinary. And it doesn't even have that intrusive flare of sunlight that can creep into the frame sometimes, which makes the unpaid pair of bodies seem frightened or caught. It looks like there was a generous budget here. The varying indoor-outdoor color schemes and temperatures are regulated by the premeditated purchase of standard shooting lights, which the professional lighting crew took some care to arrange. First, by matching each of the color lights, and then, probably without even taking a break, white balancing the room, making the tool shed look, you think, as it was probably intended to look, like a break room where mechanics go to cool off and to get away from their primary work environment, a 2-car garage. The lighting is probably about 90% of what the film crew has to pay attention to when they're setting up. Maybe not. Maybe after making sure the lighting matches the bodies, they have to make sure that the ambient sound is okay, or to make sure that it's not too cold in the room. Fascinating, you think, that Ace and Jacob probably had to maintain for the whole day, maybe even 2, the elements of their chemistry that really make their attraction for each other seem totally believable and rich to others, skeptics of love like yourself. Crucial make it or break it moments in the sequence, even if it will be all rearranged in post anyway. The initial pounce, the lift, the near come of one member or the other, while the crew adjusts several lights around them, and they are cold. Pauses like this one punctuate the cast and the crew's day, where, while 2 men who are fucking say nothing to each other, men who aren't fucking speak. As when the director Joe, who cares for his craft, who's really worked at it, turns to his lighting guy for assistance. Or when Stan and Joe are suddenly needed as Hank is busy adjusting a bounce. Certain angles you imagine must have been especially difficult to light due to the fact that one of the guys is white and the other guy is brown, a difference in skin surface that the lighting crew had to be prepared in advance to account for. They must have had to make some other kind of sacrifice to light the scene of brown Ace plowing white Jacob at this angle so beautifully, like cutting the actors' salaries so as to have enough to pay for Mark, the more wizened lighting assistants, to be there. Probably at some point, Mark needed to nervously crab beneath the couple with his new ultrafire. This is the lighting guy, strapped onto a pole, and now it's in the present tense. And who remembers briefly while he does it, being a film student who never knew how to light anything. He tries not to get insecure about it, reminding himself that what he needed here on this set is that his ultrafire would please Joe, as it will address the actor's white and brown surfaces uniquely. I'm going to shape that sack right there like you've never seen, he says, looking over at Joe while briefly burning Ace's right ass cheek with his light. Ace holds still, silently inside Jacob. Mark shoves his ultrafire mini XPE again into the curve of Ace's ass. Fuck! Sorry, man. Don't worry. From where this shot is, no one is even going to see that shit. You're fucking burning my ass, man. This is going to look great. They shoot some more. Fuck. That fucking hurts, man. I'm losing it. At this point, Jacob, the dissociating bottom, who is paler than ever, chimes in. What the hell? I don't know what the fuck's going on, babe. This fucker. We're good. Let's just go. I'm so tired. Fuck, I'm sorry I did it again. Dude, come on. The crew pauses their otherwise smooth day of shooting to medicate the burns. They then decide to reshoot the entire scene from the other side of the room so as to avoid getting Ace's blotchy burn on cam. The AD, also named Mark, takes charge and makes the crew run fast and forces them all, Joe the director, and Hank and Stan and Ace and Jacob, to skip their lunch hour so that they can make it to their later than expected deadline. You come and slam your laptop shut. A few minutes pass. You check your texts, and a momentary feeling appears. Over the next couple of minutes, you review your options. Get up and go for a walk, write a letter to a friend, get out of a chair, make any other act seem better to you for now than saying, I love you to this whatever person. Any old thing, like prying open a shut screen, pulling a rapidly shifting set of images up and staring at them until you render yourself entirely still for just long enough to know that for now, like before, your feelings can be kept all to yourself. Thanks.
Thank you, Shiv. When Renee Gladman read here, she commented on how much she loved how dirty the stage was. So you're contributing to a beautiful mosaic of poets reading here, I guess. Legacy. I'm really excited to introduce our next reader. It's her first time reading at AAWW. Rahel Aima is a dear friend and a freelance writer and editor currently based in Brooklyn. She writes about art, tech, politics, and is special projects editor at the New Inquiry. And she wrote this piece about Vanta Black, which is the darkest color that exists that I guess she won't be reading, but I thought a lot about actually I was reading Divya's book. So maybe it will come up later. All right. Give it up for Rahel.
All right, thanks for having me. Okay. So the reason the sun never sets in the British Empire, Indian statesman V.K. Krishna Menon once remarked, was that even God doesn't trust the British in the dark. But it did set in 1783 in the United States of America, in 1947 in India and Pakistan, later further splitting into East Bangladesh in 1971, the same year that several Gulf states bid farewell to their colonizers. This late century decolonizing avalanche ended in Belize, St. Kitts and Nevis, and Brunei in 1981, 1983, and 1984, respectively. Krishna Menon was described by British Raj officials as Nehru's evil genius, by Eisenhower as a menace, and by his admirers as an anti-imperialist hero who famously, an attributed quote, taught the white man his place. And he was especially adept at such pithy quips. He famously compared British imperialism and Nazism to asking a fish whether it wants to be fried in margarine or in butter. On the American policy of arming its allies ostensibly only for their defense, he noted that he had yet to see an American gun that could shoot only in one direction. When the novelist Bridget Brodie complimented him on his command of the language, he retorted, "My English, madam, is much better than yours. You merely picked it up. I learnt it." Which is really true of Old English, I have to say. So Krishna Menon is remembered today for being India's first defense minister, the architect of the non-aligned movement, and for completing an epic 8-hour filibuster about Kashmir at the United Nations. He's also mostly forgotten as the other founding editor of Penguin and Pelican, along with, and I see there's some boxes back there, along with Sir Alan Lane, who edited fiction at Penguin while he handled the non-fiction Pelican side. Ironically, this was a publishing house whose paperbacks would be how I, like so many others, would learn to speak English. And English was actually my fourth language after Malayalam, Kashmiri, and Hindi, but it's now, as these things happen, it's now become my first. So Krishna Menon was also my great-granduncle. With no children of his own, my mother's family inherited his house in Kozhikode, also called Calicut, that the Kerala government today is still trying to acquire in national interest as a museum. A childhood ring, which you can see here, is the only piece of jewelry that I've worn for years, and it represents a weighty legacy that I quickly learned not to mention for the way it refashions me not as a person but as his last relative, a funny kind of inheritance. Yet for all his post-colonial steez, Krishna Menon was not even a child of empire so much as an instrument of it. And I should have mentioned at the beginning, this is a piece I originally wrote for a Children of Empire themed issue of Leap, which is a Chinese art magazine. So hence the child of empire. Where am I? So yes, he wasn't a child of empire so much as an instrument of it, and he even served as the St. Pancras borough councillor under the Labour Party at one point. This is pre-independence. For years, I understood him vaguely, only as a figure that occasionally appeared in family photographs, as a statue, as a street, stadium, school, or other urban footnote of history. And really, I still didn't even know how to talk about this familial connection without engaging in that particularly virulent strain of diasporic navel-gazing that either conveniently elides class, casteism, and the mobility of the subject race, or alternatively functions as a performative privilege checking or mea culpa. So mine, I grew up in Dubai, I should just add, mine was a childhood spent denying Indianness with Enid Blyton, the British education system, where the story of the world ended with the close of the Great War in 1918. Playground racism, a carefully cultivated modulation and code switching of accent, and a funny, even guilty comfort with Britishness. The other day, my mother casually remarked that she thought I'd probably be happier with a Westerner. By Westerner, she means a white person, and that I'm not really that Indian. And then there is the aggressive disinterest in history that's now coagulated in a fascination with the aesthetics of futurity, but please not the white kind. So for a while now, I've been obsessed with the mental image of an egg being pulverized over plush oxblood velvet. The egg isn't raw per se, more very softly boiled, with the inside still runny and the albumin still queasily transparent, yet to fully solidify into whiteness. Surface tension keeps the yolk intact and quivering, slippery and resistant, at once visceral and viscous, with all the soundly anticipated violence of the coming integration. I suspect this is how the sun really set on the British Empire. In August 2015, I visited Sikkim with my family, a Himalayan apostrophe of a state sandwiched between Nepal, Tibet, and Bhutan, and Indian. It's an Indian state, I should add. The terrain was beautiful, or waterfalls, alpine lakes, and lush foliage. It provided a quiet education to help me understand something about the concept of post-partition India for the first time, and the whirling plurality of a country that insists on being multi-religious and multi-secular, even as it falls apart. And this was written, as you can tell, some time ago. One day, we were driven up the Nathula Pass on the Indo-Tibetan border, which is an offshoot of the historic Silk Road. The appeal appeared to be that Indians can shake hands with their Chinese counterparts across the border, a staging of the brief 1950s period of Hindi-Chini bye-bye, which is basically like India-China brothers, presumably made giddy, possibly from the 4,310-meter altitude. So we stopped at Somgo Lake, which I'm probably butchering, where I rode in a baby yak that moved at the speed of dial-up and most closely resembled a fairy recalcitrant sofa. It was a great yak. I do have a picture of it. Then we went on to Baba Mandir, a Hindu shrine dedicated to the Indian soldier Baba Harbhajan Singh, or the hero of Nathula, which was set on a high, misty plateau under the impassive gaze of what is apparently the world's highest Shiva statue. Shout out to Shiv. In what I now understand to be a terribly Dubai move. So it's agreed that Singh died in the area on September 11th, 1967, though the circumstances are fuzzier. Perhaps it was heroic. Indeed, he was posthumously decorated with the Mahavir Chakra, one of India's highest medals, for his courageous martyrdom. One soldier on duty said that he fell into a river while leading a supply train of mules. An extensive search party found no trace of the body. It was called off after a few days due to inclement weather. Yet days later, he appeared to a member of his unit in a dream, giving him the exact location where his body would be found and asking that a tomb be built on the site. The soldier, recounting the tale, was at ease with both the narrative and the small army of tourists crowded around, straining to hear him over the devotional music. He spoke not as a tour guide, but with the deep confidence of a devotee. So when another member of the regiment had almost exactly the same dream, a new search party recovered the body, and the tomb was built. More dreams, visitations, and sightings followed on both sides of the border. The spectral figure of Singh would emerge in blurry aggregate, like so many tourist photos of the same monument from the same angle, all superimposed into one. Despite being an Indian Army soldier in life, in death he became a shared military talisman, with Indian and Tibetan forces agreeing that Singh protected all soldiers around the pass, regardless of nationality. Over time, his ghost became corporalized. Along with a gift shop, Baba Mandir included a recreation of his quarters and his office. Caretakers would swear that the sheets were occasionally rumpled, the boots would be caked with mud, and food and water set out for him, every day without fail, would occasionally be depleted. Next year, actually last year now, it will be 60 years since his death, but the Indian Army still faithfully sends his family a monthly paycheck. Singh still goes on an annual vacation every September too, when his belongings are carefully packed and a small group of soldiers from his unit, or what his unit is today, escort an empty reserved train berth to his home village in Punjab and back. Even the PLA, the Chinese army, maintain a tradition of setting aside an empty chair for him at official inter-army meetings on the border, whether that's acquiescing to beliefs of their own or as a diplomatic gesture, I'm not sure. So the story is a funny little Mobius of two ghosts, one of history and another of geography. Krishna Menon's infamous, as I mentioned, he is India's defense minister. His infamous bungling of the 1962 Sino-Indian War would arguably be his own political undoing. And there's something especially powerful about this idea of a specter, this is Harbhajan Singh, that manages to transcend the failure of both the non-aligned movement and be acknowledged, if not honored, on both sides of the border. This is a ghost whose presence or legacy is so strong that it displaces water, takes up space, and consumes in the present, despite its temporal distance or location in history. These bits of colonial baggage that we all carry are at the same time, collectively and nervously built from the leftover scaffoldings of empire. The ghosts of Bandung commodified, a half-century later, as a package holiday in the end of which two NRI, or non-resident Indian, families squabble over how much to tip the guide. And I would later find that the other family were actually very staunch Hindu nationalists, which was strange to think back over that trip and realize. So Nathula Pass itself is army-controlled and restricted to Indian nationals. We were all citizens but non-resident, so we weren't able to get permission in time to visit the border. But for people like us, the same soldier tucked himself behind a small desk after he finished speaking to sell high-gloss, high-jingoism, stamped and signed souvenirs proclaiming, quote, "Memories of your visit to Nathula." And these were, I wish I had pictures of these actually, they're very dramatic kind of souvenirs. So the front page includes the choice, unattributed quotes, "Nations have no permanent friends or foes. They only have permanent interests." And they also, it also includes the seemingly original, "It takes years to build capabilities. Intention can change at any time." Original, I say, because I Googled it. And that seems to be all them. And finally, the last quote is, "Having visited Nathula, you are wiser on how Indian Army soldiers protect the nation when deployed on the border." All of this for just Indian rupees 200, which seems like an awfully low price to pay for that kind of security in your country. Thank you.
Can everyone give Rahel one more round of applause? Thank you so much. I think that's a really good segue to our last reader for the night, Divya Victor, who I'm really proud to introduce. Divya Victor's Kith is a book of verse, prose, memoir, lyric essay, and visual objects that explores what Kith might mean outside of the national boundaries of those belonging to the Indian and Southeast Asian diasporas. How and why does Kith diverge from kin, and what are the effects and politics of this divergence? The poet Rachel Zolf writes, "In Kith, it turns out that Kith is also kin, and kin is also Kith, and the neighbor is also friend, enemy, and the other neighbor's neighbor, and we are all stuck here at the limits of language, grasping for new forms of community and belonging when those words suck too, yet refuse to burn." She is also the author of Natural Subjects, Unsub, and Things to Do with Your Mouth. Her criticism and commentary have appeared in the Journal of Commonwealth and Postcolonial Studies, Jacket 2, and the Poetry Foundation's Harriet. She's visiting us here from Michigan, and she's currently working on a new project commissioned by the press at Colorado College, and we're really lucky to have her here tonight. Give Divya a big round of applause.
Hello. Hi. Hi. Thank you. Thanks, Sophia. I think, curation seems like part wrangling of cattle and part sleight of hand, and I think you've been really quite adept at doing both these things. So thank you for pulling this reading off at the last minute. And thank you, Ken, for making this space possible. I think we've been working on me doing a reading here for just 6 years. So Kith, of course, names a tendency to magnetize to people who may resemble you. It also marks a way of being couth, which is to say the opposite of uncouth, which is to say it marks a way of behaving well in a community. So it has the same root as uncouth and couth. And when I was writing this book, it became very clear to me that in order to describe who I belonged to, who I behaved with in an appropriate manner, I had to address the taxonomy of race. And that within this taxonomy of race, I had to address where and how whiteness entered consciousness and how it was composed as a phrase of anti-Blackness within my community. And so I thought today, as a relief to myself after my poetry project reading, I would just read prose and seek the comfort of sentences that describe the taxonomy of race within my community. So I'm going to read from Foreign Terms, which is the final section of Kith. It is what might be text that operates under the sign of nonfiction, or one might say memoir. Let's not say that. The word or the phrase foreign terms comes from the National Geographic Style Manual under this. Foreign words and phrases that have not yet become anglicized, which is to say, not yet found in Webster's, are italicized on first appearance in text and legends. It also contains the epigraph from Samuel Johnson's little ditty in the Rambler, published on 2nd of July, 1751, and this says, "Almost all absurdity of conduct arises from the imitation of those whom we cannot resemble." How's it sound? So these foreign terms are a list of terms alphabetized that identify ways in which foreignness entered and activated foreignness in me and through me. S is for Saget Bob. I fell in love with Bob Saget the same week I decided to trim my eyelashes. If you cut hair, it grows back thicker. If you cut your mouth trying to kiss the TV, your shame grows back thicker. Bob, you were a whiteness returning home to Honey, your wife. All of America was yours, Bob. In your smart navy blazers and neutral ties, you were like a man in a smart navy blazer wearing a neutral tie. You were as opaque as flannel. There was no entering you. I had no option but to eat you whole. Bob, you were a Christmas special all year round. And what do you want, young lady? A cat, because it's soft. Oh, how about a bath mat? That's soft. Oh, Bob. And here's another young lady. Turn around so everyone can see how pretty you are. And now what would you like? A baby. I don't think I can help you with that, but we'll see what we can do. Actual excerpts. Bob, you're killing me. Thank you. You may sit down, please, Divya. Divya, you're kissing the TV again. Bob, I would watch you. I would watch you at dinner, and I would soak my papadum in the yogurt until they were paler versions of the soft, supple brown things my sharp brown angles could never imagine. Cheerleader buns, dinner buns, donut cremes, the mound of a turkey tanning in thanks, Michael Jordan's glossy printed calves in a grown man's bedroom, the slow motion slump of a hammock soft with a fat so-and-so, and then, Bob, I would rip you apart, weeping into my curd rice, and watch how easily things broke on screen, kayaks into caravans, kids into cots, yards of crisp wrapping paper shredded by tall 6-year-olds in socks, blondes named Kevin or Kyle, small boy birds running screaming from slushy dogs, a drain pipe weighed by a Wisconsin winter claiming a puffball beanie. That's for you, Joey. And then I would eat you. I would eat you and wash you down with the grainy timestamps on the VHS tapes they all sent for your love. Bob, I thought you made these things happen. The brightest front rows of enameled teeth on the wide mouths in the front row. This laughter, this and the short queue of sleepy-hatted black dominoes crashing down on the church pew. The red, the white, the blue. Oh, the funniest thing you do, America. America, I want you. So it is unfortunate. It's an unfortunate truth that I was introduced to whiteness through Bob Saget. Certainly through the phrasing of desire. I had the biggest crush on him. I've never been cured of it. I hate to inform you. But there were versions of whiteness that arrived earlier before Bob did. As early as 1987, I was born in 1983, so that makes me 4. And so this is L for LAX to TRV economy class, so that's Los Angeles to Trivandrum economy class. It's the leg that many of my family members took. I'm from a place called Nagercoil, which is right at the border of Kerala, so it's a really good segue geographically. L is for LAX to TRV economy class. Whiteness first arrived in a Samsonite suitcase traveling from Sacramento to Trivandrum in 1987 when my Indian American family had come to visit my family. Whiteness arrived in baby auntie's copy of Glamour with Cindy Crawford on the cover. Her eyebrows were the brushed out wingspan of a pet eagle, its talons grasping an olive branch and arrows. Her earrings were drizzled yellow mustard against a dewy hot dog. Which is to say, whiteness arrived tucked into the silky, puckered compartment where baby auntie had kept her silky, puckered things and the sour, hard-boiled sweets that made my mouth into a silky, puckered thing as I sat on a parapet swinging my legs in skirts the way one is allowed to do until one's skirts start filling up with blood. Whiteness arrived as a woman's leg in a red stiletto. It began at a pale, dog-eared knee and ended at a glossy toe, and it was wrapped in a champagne-colored nylon stocking. I borrowed the magazine, and I pressed it to my chest. So realize I'm like 2 feet tall, right? This is most of me. I pressed it to my chest. Later, lying on the terracotta terrace, I placed the cool magazine page in my right leg and closed my eyes. The sun spangles lifted each eyelash like a curtain that would never again fall on my darkness. Which is to say, whiteness wasn't smuggled in, it was given the red carpet. The American dollar arrived that same year. It levitated, scented like cinnamon gum and leather, hot from my baby auntie's purse. The budding baby slumdog millionaire in me pressed its creased, greasy flatness between its hands in a fawning namaste that still turns my toes numb in shame. In 1987, $1 was worth 13 Indian rupees. One of theirs was worth 13 of ours. Today, one of theirs, of mine, is worth 68 of ours of theirs. When my aunt arrived in India, she was a new brand of Indian, a hyphenated American, as compared to us standard edition Indians, the mere Indians of Kipling, of Tagore, of Merchant Ivory films, of Ben Kingsley wrapped in khadi being photographed by Candice Bergen relaxed in khakis, of National Geographic's sympathetic coverage of our asses hanging low over all the gutters of your jungle books. In family photographs, baby auntie's hair is an autumnal bonfire, whipped by the wind, and her waistline is crimped by a bright slash of a galaxy I could never reach. Her Madras checked shift grids her curves, 75% cotton, 25% linen, which is the composition of a US dollar bill, by the way. I squint around the sparks of her halo and see the other women standing in dark silhouettes around her, their black hair parted down the middle, curtly tucked behind the ears and pulled into demure braids leading the eye to hips wrapped in layers of chiffon or cotton, straddled by my cousin's scabby and proudly ashy legs, dangling a worn rubber chappal. The front cover of that glamour magazine, which had been purchased for $1.95 at LAX, was advertising great fashion buys under $57. In 1987, $57 was 741 rupees, which would have paid a month's rent and my school fees. The rupee derives from the Sanskrit rupya, which means stamped or impressed in a rupam, a likeness or an image of something else. The rupee was stamped in the image of something else. The word for money was drawn up feet first from its Dravidian root urupu, which means from the body politic in which flesh is a kind of currency we can use to pay our way into each other's dreams. First spun from 75% cotton and 25% linen, and then folded in two and placed in a hot purse scented with cinnamon gum. One of the familial rituals, which I now reflect on with an extraordinary amount of shame, is that these California family members would show up and the first thing they would do is give us each $1. In clear practice for the begging that would happen the minute they left the house on the streets of Nagarcoil. You okay? M is for Michael Jackson and Malcolm X. In the epilogue to the autobiography of Malcolm X, Alex Haley recounts meeting a pensive Malcolm at the Kennedy airport, watching newly immigrated children romping and playing in their sudden home. By tomorrow night, Malcolm says to Alex, they'll know how to say their first English word, at which point Malcolm X says the N-word. Before cable television arrived in India, America was a white nation. I imagined New England snows dusting California and Miami's beaches stretched across Appalachia. America was a papier-mâché parody patched together by a cheaply hired prop maker. Geographic accuracy was sacrificed to the interpersonal dramas of Betty and Veronica, and the American banquet was limited to the malted and fried offerings in Pop's chocolate shop, where the Riverdale gang solved the real geopolitical problems of how to get Reggie off Moose's back with the help of Archie's fumbling charms. Here, it seemed, class warfare came with a side of fries. There were rumors, though, of distant family members settling in North Dakota or Oklahoma, names that put themselves together like Lego castles, hard-edged and jutting out with abrupt L's or particularly pokey K's. Blackness was just a rumor, too. It flickered in the background of photographs they sent back from these mysterious locations. Here's an uncle waving at us from a glittering Times Square in Los Angeles. Here's an aunt waving at us midway through the soft-focus neon breakfast with Aunt Jemima's maple syrup made from genuine maple leaves. Here is a nephew waving at us next to the poster of a red and white Michael Jordan in a quilted bedroom, his rotund body snuggled in tie-dye and tucked into tartan flannel sheets. Blackness was a rumor, that is, until Michael Jackson's Bad ripped into our consciousness, and suddenly, knobby-kneed preteens found a way to make stringy curls with coconut oil stolen from their mothers' kitchens and started moonwalking backwards into my social studies classrooms, all snappy crotch and jaunty limbed. It wasn't long before Jackson's unsparing gaze, draped in slick black leather, began replacing the glowing pastel Ganeshas and Saraswatis hanging above study desks. But replacing an elephantine god's soft paunch with lean, mean celebrity did not save us from our own ignorance of how blackness and brownness were connected through a struggle for economic realization. While kids in Chennai were rehearsing Michael Peters' signature choreography for Thriller and pretending to be zombies, little exemplary half-dead spectacles, Union Carbide was industriously shirking responsibility for the Bhopal tragedy, which choked thousands of Indians to death, and black mortality was spiking in violent homicidal protest of the USDEA's drug buys and cocaine busts. In other words, the millions blinked away Michael Jackson's blackness. We kept the heat and thunder of his fat synth bass, which found its way into Ilayaraja's electric disco in films of the late 1980s. We kept the ebullient automation of his moves, which became a muscular theme in Prabhudeva's blend of baggy breakdance and whimsical Terukuthu folk dancing in the 1990s. But we did forget his blackness. In time, the lightning of his presence was replaced by the grey hum of CNN, cops, law and order, and the dull horror of handcuffs on dark wrists. Our posters yellowed, the cassettes spooled out, and my moonwalking classmates found their scientific calculators and study guides again. But the rumors of racial difference in George Bush Sr.'s America continued to bloom and wilt in morose cycles in my childhood homes well into the 90s. In damp clusters, it grew like moss under rocks. Rootless, it stretched its stringy arms and held us by the ankles. It grew like mold between bathroom tiles. It spun itself fine, it spun itself strong, webbing into corners where our brooms couldn't reach, and in time, the mossy rocks lined our after-dinner walks past the hibiscus bushes. In time, a grandmother slipped on the bathroom tiles and stayed in bed, fed kanji by a fatherless girl brought in from the village, and the moss grew between her toes and drew her to the earth where they buried the nameless pets and the featherless chickens. In times, the spiders hung so low they fell into pickle jars every time a child fished for a gooseberry or a slice of a stony green mango from the brine. We remembered it. And from this brine in time, we learned to believe that it existed. And as the million families began drifting from the flashy monsoons to the June gloom of the California Bay or to the sharp, wet summers of the Keys, they carried the damp and the stench in suitcases, and they buried it in hushed conversations. They made a poultice of moss and spiderweb and lodged it in the prayer books, hung it around the children's necks like a talisman, and they said, as long as she doesn't marry a black man. Thank you.
Can we give another big round of applause for Divya? Thank you all so much. If you have a question, start thinking about it. You'll have a moment to ask, and all the readers are just going to come up on stage for a little bit, and I'm going to ask them a question or two about their work and the things that we got to listen to tonight. So we're going to switch into talk show mode. But yeah, if you have a question, don't be too afraid to ask. Thanks.
Oh, actual individual mics. Okay.
Thank you all so much for those readings. They were really lovely and came together in interesting and unexpected ways, in different ways than reading all your work separately, which I appreciated. I think something that the three of you are all really brilliant at is like looking at images and tracing that back to like a colonial history, like even with the porn set, like how cameras aren't calibrated to capture dark skin, or, you know, just how it's embedded in art history, and then also how looking at a photo or looking at an object can be a way to write poetry and switch forms. And I was just wondering, kind of on like a really basic level, just how you all look at images. Or I guess in particular, things that you read, maybe you can talk about how an image became a way to write about a thing.
I didn't know how to write without some source material. So, like, I think I figured out that writing was not, like, something that I had to do specifically internally, but could be, like, involve some stimuli and not, like, a ekphrastic process or something like that, but, like, just figuring out other ways to abstract things that were outside of me into language, which seemed way easier than composing some sort of interiority or something like that.
And you
sort
two
of falsified.
both specifically write art criticism as well, I should say, really well.
I mean, I don't know about that, but like it was just like a sort of way of like actually having a sort of sounding board, which was a way of composing words together as opposed to maybe different forms of like poetic logic that I had been trained to sort of read and understand in the past. I don't know.
Yeah. I think my reading of images comes from like a deep suspicion surrounding ekphrasis as a mode in and of itself, which is a mode that like poets have exploited as I think as a sort of excuse to fabricate interiorities. And for me, it's, looking at an image it's an aid to memory in that it's a confrontation, or it's an aid to memory in that it's a contradiction of what you remember. So like the image of Cindy Crawford on that Glamour magazine cover is like, it's a product of research, like going back to it, comparing it to my memory of Cindy Crawford, which is so fuzzy. For a 4-year-old, it's like, it's a memory derived from a photograph, derived from a story. There's these multiple levels of displacement. But to actually return to these archived covers on Glamour's website, you recognize how much Crawford's face, and it's a very close crop. You see some of her hair, her ears. It's coated entirely with these Americanisms. Everything about her reads optimism. It reads Reaganomics. It reads just flush with cash. And that's not my memory of it. The memory of it is just pure love, which is the opposite of flush with cash. So for me, it's engaging with images as a way to explore that contradiction, which you don't know exists within a memory.
Is that also true of the family photographs that are in Kith?
Oh yeah, I think so. Yeah, except only I know the contradictions. Yeah.
I think for me, at this point, and more since I wrote this, I primarily, I think, write about images. And for someone who does that, or write a lot about art, and for someone who does that, I think I realize I'm very suspicious of the image. And I think a lot about extending the image, or what, let's say, if it is an image, any kind of image is doing in space and time. And I think this is not the kind of writing that I would usually do. And I think it felt very much like trying to move through an image, or an image as a kind of veil, and a kind of veil that leaves a mark. Like by veil, I mean like those fringed bead doors, like which you walk through them and they're like tinkling, like kind of. I actually hate those doors, but I very much think this is about moving through an image as opposed to, that's what I think. That's not very clear.
No, I'm just thinking about how much I like those doors, because they make a sound and they, I don't know, show you that you. It's like a confirmation that you are like moving through a space in this kind of obnoxious
I always want to
way.
walk through them. I will walk through them for sure. Like I think they're like frightening but desirous, which is like a good thing, or like a sort of productive way of looking at the violence of an image. Maybe like it exposes and obscures at the same time.
Yeah, and it always betrays your presence.
Yeah.
You can never silently walk into that, right? And so it's such an announcement.
That's why I don't like them. I mean, I think you learn in certain environments to not leave a trace and to not to be stealthy, but to just link about. And I think I'm still like I'm scared of this mic. Like I think I feel the same way about those doors. Like they do betray your presence that you were here, and that's slightly terrifying.
I think I enjoyed that terror because like so much of poetry that is ekphrastic or like using image as a sort of passive aid to memory is like I'm not here, and if you've seen me, I'm just looking. It's not like I'm not co-composing this image with you, and I like the noise, I guess, of the veil. It's like, no, you're here. You've broken through. That's a problem. That's a useful problem.
I'll spill wine.
Shiv was here. Can you talk a little bit more about what you said about the violence of the image?
I don't know if I can. I think I was just thinking of the way that you were phrasing it, Rahel, like the fact that it is something that you do have to encounter, and like moving through an image does sort of take a little bit of, it takes some effort, but I mean, an image might do something to a memory which is similar. So it's like you can't have, like, all images are violent. They like really do sort of cut out something from time and space, which is like pretty chaotic and specific and weird, and turns it into something normalizing. They're weird. Management, yeah. Reality is weirder than images.
Yeah.
I think thinking about violence is a good shift to talking just about Kith in general, or kind of like the organizing principle of the book. It was really interesting to hear you talk about uncouth, which I didn't actually know, and the relationship between Kith and couth and uncouth. And I think your book does a really amazing job of bringing out these violences that are manifested in like everyday products or products of global capitalism, but also there is this maybe potential for hope, or like moving away from misidentifying belonging or something. Is that? Do
you want me to affirm that there is hope?
I guess I'm wondering, like, yes. One of the epigraphs you used in your book that I really liked was "Loss has made us a tenuous we," and I think in a lot of ways the book is an attempt to grapple with that.
I think loss is utilized as currency in the global theater. I think loss produces melancholy, which is is something that we traffic in order to produce identities that can be deployed to really dangerous ends. I learned that through studying very closely the utility of the Eichmann trials, for example. I learned that through seeing how my Kith supported Trump's presidency, for example. I learned that through what Vijay Prashad calls the inward turn of Indian communities to protect and serve the family unit, which is another way of ensuring increasing capital gains for generations to come. So I'm suspicious of the kinds of losses that we utilize to make that tenuous we. And so the utility of that epigraph, which is from Rachel Zolf's Neighbor Procedure, which is an amazing book about Israel's illegal presence in Palestine, among other things, I think I state it as a fact rather than an agreement. Loss has made a tenuous we, and the tenuousness is not the fragility that I'm celebrating or wanting to poetically capture. The tenuousness I'm worried about is that it's so easily deployable for nationalist purposes, including the presidents that we have. That tenuous we has placed us here. So I am I think the book starts from a place of being really concerned and suspicious about collectivity as one way of thinking about belonging, right? Yeah, I'm worried about the people I resemble, and I'm worried about that attraction to check in and to be along with them, like, and the kind of chauvinism it implies, and the ahistoricity it implies. Yeah. So hope is, maybe that's the next book. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's another epigraph in the book that's about, it's like a quote about housing discrimination against Indians in New Jersey, right?
Yes.
And I was thinking as I read that also, like, you know, in like organizing meetings I go to in New York, that they're like, we need to go to New Jersey because that is like the seat of the Hindu right, you know, among the South Asian diaspora in the United States, and these things are happening at the same time, or they can.
Yeah, I mean, it is also, in terms of statistics, the place of like highest incidences of violence against those of Indian descent. In the 1980s, I mean, we're all familiar with the Dot Busters, right? I mean, their explicit agenda was to set out and to identify every single Patel living in the Edison, Jersey area, and to harm them. The Dot Busters. So there's these contradictions about gentrification, accumulation, but also the violence one goes through in order to procure this.
Rahel, you had a line in your piece that you read that was about diasporic navel gazing, and I know it's something you think a lot about in your art criticism too, especially when you're asked to review like sort of South Asian art shows. And I wonder what you're thinking about that right now.
It's funny, I'm actually just thinking about that because I just did review, and I think I'm worried doing it for that reason. I just reviewed another show by an Indian American, and I realized I think I'm unfair to diaspora, I think, because that's the one thing that I feel extremely weird about. And I think some of that is about being kind of neither necessarily from a country or ever having immigrated. In bio legal terms, I have an Indian passport and that mobility, but I haven't lived in India as an adult for more than a few months, that kind of thing. I guess I'm suspicious of images and I'm suspicious of diaspora. I think there seems to be something very dangerous, and I think it speaks to what it's that, you know, that wanting to assimilate, but also kind of reproducing everything that was terrible and kind of holding very closely to that as a means of holding on to your identity. I don't know where I'm going.
Shiv, did you have anything that you wanted to... is that something you were thinking about as you were writing the switch, or is it not?
What was the original question?
I couldn't tell you. I think I was asking Divya if there was hope. But I think it's become a different question.
It has become a different question. I think I'm like very skeptical of diaspora, but I'm also skeptical of the things that diaspora in the really localized community, i.e. the family structure, comes with. And so like, I think one thing I was thinking about specifically in the switch is like, the things that you idolize as an adult in your social situations, whether those be white people or non-white people, or I don't know, what do people like? Famous people or something like that. But also like how that sort of reflects or sort of mirrors a specific kind of way of learning within the domestic space. Yeah. So like I've been thinking a lot about like iconography, and like the last poem in the book is about Lord Shiva, as you mentioned, and it's really trying to figure out like how devotion is related to queerness, is related to idols, is related to like the specifically kind of like mutant, weird male, female gods and goddesses that had no taboos attached to them before the British came to India. Like fucking was happening all of the time as, I don't know, as image or as what, but so it was just a way of sort of working through that. So I'm definitely thinking about the diasporic tradition, but for me, who was born in California, I was just left over with a bunch of objects, and so it was like sort of piecing together that, if that makes any sense. Yeah.
I would add to that, I think, and I've been thinking about this just because Section 377, which is a colonial law of which decriminalizes gay sex, just got repealed again for the second time. And I've been thinking about this because it is something that I hear a lot, that this was a colonial invention. It wasn't. I mean, there is a certain fluidity and I think it's just a different vocabulary of desire that you have, but I think it's, and I think this is not to you personally, but this comes down to the thing of diaspora, of like taking parts and not the whole, maybe, of an original culture. I don't know how to put it exactly. There's things were pretty bad in terms of sex and gender for a lot of people before the British came along, and like that's a legal codification, but it's not like they invented at all discrimination or certain ways of being.
No, I mean I totally agree with that. Like,
and that's
right.
Yeah, so that's a specific example, but I think that is the thing that kind of gets me about diaspora, I guess. But I mean, I will say, kind of speaking to what you were saying, I feel like one thing that I think, especially in South Asian communities, is a really deeply rooted anti-Blackness, and I find that I see that less in hyphen American communities than in, I will say, in other kind of, let's say, non-resident Indian communities elsewhere. I mean, like Michael Jackson, for example, I think I still don't know what happened to Michael Jackson. I think when I asked at some point, my parents were like, first they told me he got into an accident with shoe polish. This is when I was very young. Like, this is a direct quote. And then they told me he had something happen to his skin. I don't think I ever fully understood it, but I think of Michael Jackson as like the most, for example, violent image. I don't know how old I was. I remember being probably like a preteen or something at a white friend's house, and I forget what song it is. I don't think it's bad, but the song about being black or white, and like the mother, and she was a lovely woman, but the mother was kind of like trilling, she trilled, everyone knows this doesn't matter. And I think I was young enough and had grown up in the kind of in British environment or British school environment that I was like the mother was like, it doesn't matter if you're black or white, and I was like, really? You know what I mean? Like, I knew that in an abstracted level, but it was really probably being 12 or 13 that, thanks to this image of Michael Jackson, that I was like, oh, that's right. I know that, but now I know it in a known way, which is still wild to me.
I was obsessed with that video. Like, do you remember all of the faces? Yeah. You could just become anybody, which is a funny non-thing. Anyway, that's what I have to say about Michael.
I hate Michael.
Well, I talked probably more than I said I was going to, so I want to give everyone a chance to ask a question if they had one. Does anyone want to ask our readers a question? We have an audience mic coming out.
Very nice. Try it.
I have a question for Shiv. It seems like in your piece, in this excerpt, that the imaginary sort of shifts at various points, right, to take on different subjective trajectories. Maybe you disagree with this, but I wonder if, I'm kind of curious about the framing happening, and at what point you made a conscious decision perhaps to sort of end a particular imaginative, sort of imaginary sort of projection. Because I can imagine this going on infinitely, right? That you can sort of find yourself tracing. I could imagine the lives of these crew members, right, on set. So I just was curious how you imagine the frame of this piece.
I probably have a very dumb answer. Like, I was just trying to write short things, and like every time I've tried to write a poem, I've only been able to think about poems in like book forms, and I think that this comes from like a lot of conversations I've had with you and with like friends in the audience, Joey. Like, how to make poetry look like sculpture was like a conversation like I remember 8 years ago having, which is not new by any means, but like I think I was trying to limit myself so as to like actually produce something that was like, I need to work within 5 pages. I needed to produce like something that actually fits that. And I work best with constraint. So like actually negotiating that was kind of simple. What I read tonight was actually a pared down version of what appears like in print. And I don't know, my poetics are like TLDR. And so like to like cut down is a task. Yeah, I don't know if that answers it, but that's.
That makes me curious. So, pieces that you wrote came out of conversations that the two of you had together?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot. I don't think writing is a hermetic activity. I think it's a social one.
Yeah.
That's it.
I just meant
it has to be shared. But like, well, yeah, no, I mean, we Divya and I were in Buffalo together 8-9 years ago, where I did my master's and you were finishing your PhD.
We had youth together.
Yeah. And cheaper beer.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of those ideas really did stick with me for a long time, specifically in regard to like thinking about a poem as something that's not a discrete object on a page very clearly is, you know, a conversation that was like in the air, and the ways that form fucks with politics or identity, and the ways in which like you could kind of like really reduce identity to really sort of specific blank things. I was really kind of interested in how that worked. I mean, Divya, one thing, can I ask a question? One thing I'm very, like, your writing has changed a lot in the last couple of years. And one thing I'm just interested in is the way that you are using description. And there's so much language that is like palpable. Like your writing is like, it's in the mouth, right? It's like really like, and you present that as well, performing both tonight and last night. And so I'm just wondering like what role that might play in terms of your thinking about, in terms of the content itself, in terms of identity. Like, does this really dense lyrical description like have something to do with how you've been thinking about identity shifting in the last like 5 years? I don't know. And I don't know what I'm asking.
It's a really massive question. And I think one of the things that Kith does consistently with all my other books, but in a different way, is that it catalogs shit as a way to account for history. But it does so through very, as you say, very dense descriptive modalities. Whereas in the past, my books have taken sparer forms like lists, instruction manuals, borrowed language in order to do the same work. So there is an assertion or querying of like, I guess the gaze is procured and imposed upon the description itself, or in order to produce the description. I think that's the biggest shift, is that this acknowledgement that that in order to speak about identity, quote unquote, as like a fabrication on a demographics form, I have to in fact become involved, and that's like the most inconvenient thing that like Kith marks, is this admittance that I have to become involved.
I'm very satisfied.
I aim to please Shiv.
We have time for one more question, if anyone has another one they want to ask. Two sprung up at the same time.
Still formulating.
Okay.
Maybe we can take your question right after hers, and they'll kind of answer together.
I would rather not ask my question, only because it's kind of embarrassingly remedial.
Let's welcome.
Okay, I'm already in the middle, so I'm just gonna out with it. Okay, so I had this realization in therapy that as I construct narratives about myself, as time passes, my understanding of those narratives change, and then I'm always like in a process of realizing fictions in retrospect. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering, as especially like for those on the stage writing more in terms of like memoir, right? Like I'm wondering if you were to place what you read tonight, if you were to like identify how much of what you read was like what feels like real testimony, and how much of what you read feels like artifice or like fiction or like enhancement for the purpose of the making of that testimony or the delivery of that testimony. Like when it comes to constructing a narrative of self in public, like there's labor that goes into the delivery of that. And so I'm just curious about like what that balance is for you. If there is a balance, or if there's always like a feeling of necessity of like, this is like bare truth at bottom, or if there is like a kind of craft at work in the making of it. I'm just curious about that as like someone reckoning with the making of my own self narratives.
Hals, like, as I was saying in the introduction, let's not call it memoir, though it is most recognizable as memoir. I think in those pieces that I read specifically, a subject position is like a convenient artifice for an argument. You know, in order for me to actually essay, to actually wonder, I need to begin with a plausible body. It's forensic, like what's on the floor. Let's look at it. Let's measure it. It's the place from which research can begin, right? So like I actually don't think of the memoir activity that there as reaffirming that subject position, mostly so a kind of, it's a possibility from which to look, and that's artificial. I mean, it has to be in those sections. But there's a lot of the book that's concerned with autobiography as genre and as method, and as a inherently corrupt method that reconstructs the memory which is being described. So there's a section called No Man's Land, which is just about it, that really deconstructs and takes apart all the props that are in one scene of a theater for memory that I have going. And it's just about those objects that constitute the memory rather than a feeling or an experience or its relevance to my subject position. So all I can do when I write autobiography is to say autobiographical, autobiographical, still autobiographical. I'm just pointing to show you all the props that make up autobiography. Yeah.
I feel like I'm giving you the same answer for everything, but I will say writing in any kind of personal register, and I think, if I do think about this, this is maybe why I primarily write criticism. I think writing in any kind of personal register makes me very uncomfortable because I feel there is an authenticity kind of imperative, and I feel like no one's going to know, right? Maybe if someone reads it, maybe people who know me very well read it, notice minute details that are out of place, that seem like kind of glossed over or changed, but I feel like I could not. I feel like writing in this kind of register is testimony, and you're not supposed to lie in court. I'm sure people do. I mean, they do it all the time. They're doing it right now, and I feel. I don't know. I mean, I understand the memoir is as constructed. It's again the gap between knowing something and recognizing maybe how to navigate it. I mean, I feel like there's places like even what I read tonight, like the kind of diasporic navel gazing I was talking about. I feel like you can't I can't talk about certain subjects, primarily myself, my family, any kind of personal history, without a whole kind of, like bonfire of like qualifiers and needing to, I don't know, qualifiers, validators, legitimators, and that's after I feel like I'm trying to be as truthful to what I don't know, truthful to my memory or idealized sense of self as possible. Yeah.
I'm just gonna talk. I definitely take like issue, or I find memoir as a genre specious, but I find it really interesting when I think I've learned how to do this, or how to authorize my own voice as a person of color who's writing something like memoir or something like personal statements, because I assume that people assume that I have some insider knowledge as to what this identity makes or how it's made. And so I really like the phrase you use, like the labor of like performing this specific identity. And I think that the fictional element, or the enjoyable element for me, comes in like starting from the place that like my audience will assume that I'm going to give them something. And so like actually using that as a kind of tool to either fuck with, play with, or like construct something that didn't exist, if that makes any sense. Like actually having the any identitarian kind of positioning, whether that be like queer dude, Indian dude, whatever, tall dude, like those are just like the stand-ins. Those are the I'm just like the paper figure, and then like things can happen.
We had one more question.
I feel like we kind of already answered this. This question has to do with my friend's infuriation with a very kind of treacherous image that got hung up in LA on Sunset Boulevard. Jill Soloway's I Love Dick, which kind of flattens what that is about into like a very flat statement with phrase and then the cowboy men. And I'm wondering, in the kind of work that you do at a psychological level, do you ever worry about kind of reifying an image of whiteness and kind of in deconstructing it or historicizing it, that at a psychic level it still doesn't quite, or it's problematic, and in as an alternative, maybe kind of fomenting some sort of future that is based on different images, not ones that are already kind of.
Yes, I do. I mean, I think archival work has to be future-oriented, and I think of my role as an actuarian of archives that I've inherited. And that work of taking stock of images, of cataloging them, of interpreting them, of seeing them, is the kind of futurity that I'm proposing. Because if I'm not accounting for absence in an archive, then I don't see the work of interpretation as working, as the work of description as necessary. And I think descriptions of whiteness entering consciousness, for me, is absolutely a way of imagining a futurity outside of that. But I don't think that is my present. It's not the present of my child. It's not the present of my family. It's certainly not the present of our politics. So the work has to be necessarily utopian, but it's stymied by the dearth of the archive, I guess. And so the more I write into it, the more fleshed out it becomes, the more embodied it becomes.
I think at least where I am, I assume that everything I do and produce, whether it's my self-presentation through to anything I might write, does verify whiteness, and I think that is almost unavoidable in a certain sense. The kind of space I'm interested in is, I think it's also possible to not explicitly verify whiteness, but also be an instrument of white supremacy and to keep reproducing and furthering that system even when it's anything that's about moving maybe beyond the visual, or it's not just the visual. Like, I think there's a lot of people who think very deeply about this stuff, but who are still reproducing a certain kind of logic of the way of the world, and that's, I think, a more difficult thing to overcome. I will say one thing. I feel like I spent my whole, not my whole life, maybe my whole writing life, or much of it, trying to, I think, aspiring to the raceless, agendered kind of the blank zero individual, which is the person without identity, the person who's just, the person who can write about fuzzy slippers and not about their whatever. Like, it's a familiar story, probably familiar to most people in this room. And I think one thing I'm moving more towards, so she talked about looking, let's say, writing about images, writing about what something does in time and space, but also recognizing that there is a body that's encountering those images, and it's a specific body, not, like, I feel like if I'm writing a lot of the criticism I write, I'm always thinking about what is a person. I think sometimes I think about my mother, for example, someone without specific knowledge, what is this saying to them? But also I think I imagine a blank person, and that blank person is a white person, essentially, in the way that blankness is, or universal, is constructed here. So I think a lot of it is like thinking about being a specific body in space, and not just, this unmarked body. Because
I would add that I don't see reification happening as through the process of the positive reproduction of images or descriptions of images, but reification occurs when those images disappear in plain sight, and you assume that that is the world you are in, that you are not seeing it, but that is the it you are being. And I think that is how whiteness permeates and reifies, that it becomes invisible. And to remark upon the image of whiteness is to pull it out from the background, to draw it out of the context and say, you're not my context. Not always.
I think it's a good place to stop. We started off thinking about images, and we kind of circled back to it with whiteness. Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming. We have copies of the books, and I'm sure Divya would be happy to sign yours. And Rahel has a picture of herself on the yak from the story she read. She can show it to you if you ask nicely. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sophia.
Thank you.